Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Translational Science Methods Club. This is a virtual event series where we come together to learn about and discuss the use of quantitative methods with a focus on how they allow us to translate from health data science challenges to the inferences we can make for the populations that we study. My name is Sarah, and I'm a second-year PhD student in Cognitive Neuroscience at UCL. This seminar series is a project that I started as part of a community scholarship scheme supported by the Turing Institute and Roche Partnership. This Methods Club is designed to facilitate a discussion and engage researchers, in particular early career researchers, both from academia and industry, with data science challenges and applications in healthcare, focusing in today's session on explainable AI. So for this session, we will be joined by three excellent speakers. Sophie Martin, who's currently a PhD student in the Medical Center for Medical Image Computing at University College London. Her research focuses on using deep learning and neuroimaging to predict dementia, and she applies explainable AI as a tool to aid clinical translation. Dr. Ahmed Salih is a health data scientist and focuses in his research on estimating biological, so brain and cardiac in particular, age using machine learning models. And he applies explainable AI in particular to cardiology. Finally, we will hear from Dr. Rohan Chakraborty, who's a theme lead with the Turing-Roche Partnership, and focuses, amongst other things, on transparent AI in healthcare and works on developing fair and responsible explainable AI methods for personalized healthcare and precision medicine. So just briefly before we start the agenda for today, we will first hear from Ahmed, who will provide an introduction to current approaches of evaluating explainable AI, its weaknesses and limitations, and speak specifically about an application in cardiology from his own research. Then we will have a short Q&A opportunity following this talk before we move on to Sophie Martin. She will be speaking about the application of AI to brain imaging data, specifically for dementia, which aims to validate whether the results of explainable AI methods are actually biologically relevant. And then the final section of the talks will be by Rohan on the development of transparent, responsible, and safe AI systems for healthcare applications using explainable AI models, and also the role of uncertainty quantification of the model predictions for the purposes of decision-making. And after that section of short talks, we will have a general panel discussion where the audience will get the chance to ask questions to all of our speakers. And we have some pre-prepared prompts that will be discussed by our speakers. So please enjoy. And I will hand over now to Ahmed. Yes.
Okay. So, hi everyone, and welcome to the Translation Science Method Club Explainable AI. Today, I'm going to talk about one of the recent publications that we aim to see how explainable AI is evaluated the application in cardiology. So briefly about AI, explainable AI, and the rationale. Why do we need to evaluate explainable AI? And also the approaches and our review paper. But starting with the artificial intelligence, I think we all agree that the AI has shown massive success in a variety of domains, including healthcare, biology, finance, education, medicine, and other more domains, and particularly with the healthcare. So this was, I think, 3 months ago, I did search with the term of machine learning in PubMed, and I aimed PubMed because has published papers related to life science and biomedical topics up to 23, and you see like thousands of papers every year are published in PubMed. But if we compare it with the number of devices that approved at USA and European Union based on AI, so the number is very small, and there is really a big gap between both these numbers. And even when I checked the recent numbers, still the gap is big. And the question is why there is such a gap between those two. The reason is the lack of a trust, because we don't trust all AI systems. And that's bringing us to to our topic, and explainable AI. So usually we have set of inputs, whether they are tabular data, image, or any other kind of data, and we have output and the prediction, whether it was classification or continuous variable. We don't know what is going inside. And the aim of explainable AI to make this box transparent, so we can see what is going on inside, and we understand how this input are transferred into the output. So why do we need it as a human? So usually, like I can't say today, this could be like in past, or because today is different. So usually we have a model, and we train this model, and then we, for example, provide a cat and say, like, what is this? And says, this is a cat with probability 93%, which is very high. But why? Why we, as an end user, why the model thinks this is a cat? There is no justification. And what we need is the model tell us why the model thinks this is a cat, because it has fur, it has whiskers, it has clothes. So we need justification. So once we have justification, we understand why the model makes this decision. And there are different forms of explainable AI. There is no, let's say, standard one that we should follow. So some of them could be a heat map, where it shows us where the model was focusing when make a decision. For example, here it shows the heat map on the face of the dog when we ask the model to predict if there is a dog in the picture. Similarly here, when we ask it if there is a cat. Could be a list of informative predictors globally. For example, this is a list of the most important predictors in the model to classify individuals into diabetes versus non-diabetes at the global level, which means for all subjects. Could be a local explanation. So, for example, this is a local explanation shows for one single individual in the model how these features contributed to each of these classes, and to what extent the model is certain, and how each one of them, the effect size, which has mean the coefficient value for each one of these features. Or could be like a decision tree, for example, how they came up with the decision that this is an elephant and this is a dog based on some several questions. But with the AI model, so usually if we have a classification or regression, we have some standards measure that we use to see if the model perform well or not. But how about these forms or this explanation, how we assess them? So let's consider a scenario. For example, I have cardiac MRI, and I put them in a CNN model, and then provide a test data, see if this individual has a heart failure, and it says it has a heart failure, and then I applied explainable, or it's already embedded in the model. Then it tells me like a heat map, the region that the model was focusing when make this decision. The question is, can I trust this? Does this region has to do with heart failure? Does really the model was focusing here? I don't know yet. Another scenario for the same issue, that I applied different models, and the accuracy of decision tree and LGBM model or logistic regression and support vector classifiers. So the accuracy is somehow like they're relative and they're close to each other, but each one of them, they provide a different explanation. So for example, body mass index here is the third one, while with the support, for example, support vector machines just go down, and for the logistic regression, it's much more down. And then which one of them I trust, even their accuracy, like they are close to each other. And also there are other reasons that I need to evaluate explainable because they affect the quality of the explainable AI. Among them, the collinearity among the features, the adversarial tags, and also the causal association, because usually they are statistical association, not causality. And also how I can make a trade-off between the explainability and the performance. Do I need to always apply like advanced model to get high performance, but maybe not very interpretable? These and much more that's necessary that I should evaluate the explainable AI. And the approach is to evaluate whether human grounded, to include human, or proxy grounded, guideline grounded evaluation, or literature grounded evaluation. With evaluation approach, including a human as layperson, we could test a new product where misinterpreting is not severe. It's easy to implement, somehow cheap, cost of mistake is not severe, and could be implemented in simple tasks. The weaknesses is subjective, no experts, and could be biased. One example is I have a company of product in different mobiles, and mobile with high selling rate. And all of them, they have this feature: size, memory, camera resolution, CPU space, security. I can train a model using these features, test and apply explainable AI, then I have a list of formatted features. What I can do is I ask the users with a questionnaire, why did you buy it, rank in order of importance? And then the questionnaire results, I can compare it with the explainable AI to see if there is agreement between them or not. Another kind of a human grounded when I involve experts, not laypersons, and this particularly useful when misinterpreting is severe. Somehow easy, and the good thing is relevant experts in the domain are included, but cost of mistake is severe. This is one of the weaknesses, and also expensive because each model or each case needs its own experts, and also subjective. Even if there is an agreement between the experts, could be subjective. Back to our example here, so then we can ask a cardiologist or a group of cardiologists whether the explainable AI makes sense or not. These are another, let's say, criterion to evaluate explainable AI using human-grounded evaluation, which I'm not going into details. The proxy, here we are aiming to use some statistical method. So misinterpreting severe or not, that's fine. And it's cheap because we don't need an expert. Not biased, this let's say, it's not really not biased, it depends on other factors. But the weakness is that there is no standard measure or a formal definition to consider, still because in the development process. Here are some examples. For example, selectivity or remove and train, normalized movement rate, modified informative position. So selectivity or remove and train, for example, if I have a model with accuracy 0.88, what would happen if I remove the top feature like logos, age, body mass index, remove and train and test the model again? Will the model accuracy goes down? In principle speaking, it should, but it depends also on the correlation between the collinearity between those three I removed and those still in the model. Another one, the normalized movement rate. So I have this model and a glucose is the top one. So what would happen if I remove a glucose, train, test, and apply explainable again? Will I get the same order as before, excluding glucose, of course, or will I get another order like insulin jump above because there is a correlation between insulin and glucose, and when a glucose is not on the model anymore, so insulin jumped above. The third, which based on guideline grounded evaluation, and here is one of the that proposed to evaluate the outcome of XAI. So we have input XAI, and there are some steps, and for each steps, they evaluate whether the XAI passed this criterion or not. And then to the end, then they will, for example, recommend whether deployed or not in clinical practice. And the guideline could include both human proxy as well. The last one is literature grounded, which you apply explainable AI, then you compare your results with what have been published before to see if there is agreement or not. It's easy. And you can find a lot of also publication, especially like those in the brain and cardiac, apart from those rare diseases. The issue here is we might be selective and pick only those that align with our results. And also we have to consider the variation. It's really difficult to find a model with exactly the same number of features, sample, and etc. When we checked how this evaluation approach applied in cardiology, so we searched in Web of Science, Scopus, PubMed, and removing duplication, those not included cardiac data or explainable AI, and we ended up with 213 studies to review. So what we found, so 92 of these papers, they didn't use any kind of explainable AI. They didn't use any kind of evaluation to evaluate explainable AI. And only a small number of them, they use expert and proxy-based. And 79 literature, because this is, like the easiest one. And some of them, they used, for example, expert and based. That's why maybe you find the number more than 213. In terms of the most used explainable AI, so we find SHAP, CAM, GradCam, LIME, and XGB repository. So challenges and possible solution, what we found, so some of them, they use a small size samples, so data augmentation and transfer could be key. Which model we don't know, try several model, which explainable AI depends on data type and the model. The evaluation also depends on the available resources and the domain. If we include experts, please report all the details because some of them were missing how many experts and their specialties, etc. Collinearity, there are some proxies proposed there to deal with the collinear, which is a big issue in medicine. And just recently published in the Artificial Intelligence Review. Thank you for the question.
All right. Thank you so much, Ahmed. That was very, very informative. Perhaps you'd like to actually share your review paper in the chat as well, so that people can have a read afterwards. So before we move on to short Q&A on your presentation, I just want to bring up a minor correction that I've also posted in the chat just now, as the panel discussion will actually be recorded for this session. But if anyone has questions or comments that they prefer to not raise publicly, please just send them to me via the chat privately here on the Zoom call, and I can raise them anonymously for you. All right. Does anyone on that note have any questions for Ahmed? Any clarification questions or comments? Thank you, Ahmed, for sharing. It's in the chat now for whoever's interested. If we have no pressing questions, we can move on to the next talk. Okay, all right, then I'll hand over to Sophie.
Thank you. Okay. Can you see my slides? Fine.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. So hi everyone. Thanks, Sarah, for inviting me to speak today. So I am Sophie. I'm a final year PhD student in the Center for Medical Image Computing at UCL. And like Sarah mentioned, my research is all about exploring explainable AI in the context of dementia prediction. So actually that was a really nice talk to follow on from, because this project that I'm going to explore focuses on the validation side of visual explanations. And I guess it would align closest with perhaps some of an in-between of the proxy-based evaluation methods that Ahmed's described, and potentially some of the literature-based ones. But when I show some results, that will make a little bit more sense. But the motivation of this work kind of follows on quite nicely about this need for explainability to improve trust and wide-scale adoption of AI. And in this case, since I'm looking at dementia, I'm using brain images primarily for training my models. So I'm most interested in visual explanations that kind of give us some understanding of which regions of the brain are contributing to a prediction of dementia or risk of dementia. And this example here is just an illustration of sort of when using black box models can go wrong. So this is a non-medical context, but this review kind of highlighted how a network was able to correctly classify that this image contained a horse, but after further investigation, using explainable AI, they were able to reveal that it was just relying on sort of imbalance in the distribution of the data, in the case where here, a lot of the images of the horse had a timestamp in the bottom left, and that was what it was using to make its prediction. So obviously we wouldn't want something like this to be the case when we're using brain imaging, such as some sort of background noise that is present more in dementia patients versus healthy. Those are the sorts of things that can lead to misleading results. So the motivation for my project is actually along the same lines as Ahmed's work, where I started off by conducting a review specifically looking at papers which applied machine learning for dementia. So the left-hand side is a broader view of the number of papers that evaluate explainable AI over recent years. And the right-hand side is a review paper that we conducted looking specifically at applications of explainable AI to dementia prediction. And if I zoom in slightly, you'll see that what I was most interested in is one, the sorts of architectures that people were most using. So we didn't restrict necessarily to neuroimaging, but we found that the most popular methods were those that involved convolutional neural networks, or CNN, in the top panel here, but also which sorts of explainability techniques are people applying to these models. And unsurprisingly, some of these align closely with what Ahmed found in cardiology, where you've got GradCam or class activation mapping as quite a popular technique, but also more model agnostic techniques such as occlusion and SHAP or shapely values being applied to these models as well. So we moved on from this to address some of the limitations of this work. One being that although we can see quite a popular reliance of CAM, there were 9 papers which actually applied more than one method. And I think this touches on some of the challenges of explainable AI, where you can actually get different results depending on the method that you use, and understanding which one is best isn't necessarily straightforward. So that motivated us to design this specific study, where the question we're trying to ask is which explanation method is best for the model, data, and or task. And we aim to design an experiment to systematically compare these different explanation methods against one another, using some sort of ground truth that we've defined in the context of dementia. So the data that I'm using for this is quite a unique data set. It's called the AMIPAD Consortium or data set, made from 17 sites across Europe, containing about 1,300 research participants. And the aim of this work was actually to focus on early signs of dementia, on risk of disease. So people were recruited that were relatively healthy cognitively, but they underwent something called amyloid PET imaging. And this is a type of PET imaging which essentially aims to highlight the presence of amyloid plaques in the brain, which are associated with Alzheimer's disease specifically. So you can use this as kind of like a biological reference for the presence of Alzheimer's disease amyloid plaques. And one nice unique thing about this data set is that we have access to visual reads from multiple raters. So these are labels, positive or negative, that have been assigned by radiologists, telling me whether this person is kind of abnormally at risk of having dementia or have an abnormal level of amyloid in the brain based on the brain scan. So this is kind of how we set up the training. And this is what allows us to do some quantification by kind of using this to define our ground truth. So just to give you a bit more information on this data set, What the results that I'm going to present today are actually results from just a smaller cohort, a preliminary subset that I used to get some early results out. And this was about a tenth of the data set. So I just did a small training test evaluation cycle here, where I took the baseline or the first PET scan that each participant had, and I have about 34 positive cases and 166 negative cases. And you can see the distribution on the top right. The graph on the bottom right is for reference that in some cases, one of the issues with this is that there can be some noise in the label. So whilst each rater gives a definitive positive or negative based on the scan, quantitatively, you can also disentangle some what they call gray zone subjects, where it's not exactly clear on the scan whether or not this person is positive or negative. But this can kind of come in a little bit later. So just to get into the results, I used a 3D ResNet model to do the training here. And you can see the model was exposed to MR aligned. So this is making sure that everybody's PET scan is aligned with their native brain space, and a label depending on whether it's positive or negative in terms of the amyloid signal. And for those who aren't familiar with PET imaging, I've overlaid the PET signal here. So the top row is a negative subject and the bottom is a positive subject. And you can see that there are more intense red pixels for the person with high amyloid uptake. So my aim really is to explain or use this framework to compare explanation methods based on whether a model that is trained to classify positive and negativity is actually looking at the biologically relevant signal. And this is sort of the validation framework that I'm picking up. So in this work, I'm comparing three popular techniques based on the literature. So the first is backpropagation, which is kind of just a relatively simple visual explanation technique, just using the learned gradients from a network. The second is occlusion, where you systematically hide patches at a time, and then you measure the difference in the output. And the third is GradCam, which you've heard of in a previous talk, which is similar to backpropagation, but essentially uses the last convolutional layer to backpropagate those learned high dimensional features into the input space. So here you can just see some of the results from this preliminary study. So I'm showing on this slide just the group level explanations for a positive amyloid subject or somebody with high amyloid uptake. So the first thing we needed to make sure was that the model was relatively good. Whilst we weren't optimizing for performance, you do want a model to be a model which isn't good at predicting probably won't give you very useful explanations. So that was the first part. And the main takeaway here is that we can see that there are definitely differences in the method that you choose. Now, occlusion is quite computationally expensive, and you can see here that I've not got high enough level of granularity or resolution for the level of detail that I need in the brain. So it's quite a difficult technique to apply here. But both guided backpropagation and GradCam highlight some specific regions. And to move forward, I needed a way of choosing which method was best. And for a very crude approach, here I'm just taking the method which gives me the largest difference between the signal for a positive and a negative subject. So this is sort of a proxy for saying how specific are the explanations to the label. In this case, it's GradCam. So taking that method further, I wanted to actually think about how would this be useful? And in this case, we're actually more interested in the individual level explanations, because that's where we can compare specifically to the PET image and see if the explanation aligns with the signal from the biological binding. And that's what I'm showing here. You can see for the different methods, GradCam and backpropagation, they align sort of visually to the regions where we have high amyloid uptake. So that's good. That means that our model is indeed using kind of the right information to inform its prediction. So there are some extensions or explorations that we can learn from this, such as some of the way that we classify, beyond just visual classification, amyloid positivity, negativity depends on a threshold, a kind of well-defined threshold for the amount of amyloid in a particular region. So this kind of understanding can actually potentially help us adjust this in terms of thinking about what the best threshold to use would be to maximize agreement with visual readers, for example. We could also use these heat maps to address cases where raters may disagree, or like I mentioned before, cases which are gray zone or potentially ambiguous, and using these explanations to help us decide whether somebody is negative or positive. So that's just a brief overview of the preliminary work. I'm currently working on training on the complete data set, which has been done. And my next steps are going to be thinking, like I mentioned, about the ambiguous cases, and also thinking about whether or not we need tracer-specific models as well. In this case, I've only showed results for a specific tracer to do the binding, but there are alternatives out there on the market. And also I will start to do some more quantitative evaluation. So I've just shown you the visual side-by-side comparison, but we could easily align those and generate some quantitative metrics to actually capture which method is picking up the most relevant signal in the brain. So that's all my slides. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Sophie. That was very interesting application, and really excited to see your future work on this data set as well. Do we have any questions from anyone in the audience? I just see some clapping hands, so that's good. If there are no questions, I think we can move on to the final talk and then have more time for the panel discussion. Okay, Rohan, the floor is yours.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. So my talk will be more aimed towards distinguishing between whether we need transparent models in healthcare applications, or is it enough to have interpretable decisions? Given that patients and clinicians are the end users, do we actually need for the models to be transparent? Or is it enough if we show that the results, we have confidence in the results, and the decision process is aligned with the clinical decision process? So, well, we have maybe thousands of explainable AI research papers coming out every year in healthcare. And we know that very few of them get translated to the clinic. And there are some good reasons for that. Of course, you would want to be cautious, given this is a high stakes application area. But even given that, the conversion rate of research to the clinic is not high at all. And to achieve that translation, explainable AI is the way to go, as the recent EU AI Act has mandated. And we are going to have a similar, I'm sure, rules in the UK as well soon. And explainable AI is highlighted in those mandates. So in this short talk, I will go over a few of the different methods we are looking at, myself and my group. So I will go through two aspects of explainable models and 2 aspects of interpretable decisions. And then I will open up the discussion on which the audience thinks is more important for healthcare applications. So there are many ways of doing explainable AI in healthcare. The other speakers have mentioned a few, including causality. I am going to mention 2 methods. First one is hybrid, what I call hybrid deep learning. Here, basically, you start with a deep learning model, which is sort of pre-trained as the backbone to get a quick coarse output. Just also pointing out, I mostly work with medical images. I have a computer vision background and mostly cancer images. So radiology and digital pathology. So you use a deep network to get a quick coarse output. And then you have a mechanistic head, which is interpretable, transparent, whatever you want to call it, but differentiable. And you have the final fine-tuned output at the end. And you train it end to end, right? So there are many different names for it, each subtly different, but sort of in the same genre. You can, some people call it declarative neural networks. There are another class of networks called physics-inspired deep learning. But basically, you have a deep network and a mechanistic model, and you train them end to end to get an output, whereas the last bit of it is the transparent bit. 2 examples of it. So here we have input image for cell segmentation from digital pathology images. You have a base framework, a pre-trained deep network. It can be something like well, it can be a SegNet or UNet or HoverNet or something like that. It can also be these recent foundation models which are starting to come out, like CellSAM. So with a cell segment anything model. You get the initial segmentations, and then you have a mechanistic model which is completely transparent, and the equations are differentiable so that the gradient can flow backwards, and you can train it to get the final output, which is cell segmentation. So for example, here you might have overlapping cells, and since annotations are costly in these kind of applications, you only perhaps have a few annotations of the clearly segmented cells. So if you use the first bit of network, you get the simple cells segmented. And then you use, in this example, we have a model which mimics water flow. And the pressure of the water flow increases when you have a junction. And so it cuts through overlapping cells. There can be many other sort of arrangements as well. For example, here we have CT lung cancer images. Again, you can have initial deep network to do the first bit of segmentation, sort of a rough output. And then you can have things like level sets or graph cuts to do the final bit of segmentation. So we call it hybrid deep learning. This part I will quickly go over because Sophie has very nicely covered it, which is the alignment of clinical and learned features. Now, the additional bit I would like to stress on. So these sort of visualization techniques like RADCAM, etc., are post hoc techniques, and these are nice to have the confidence that the AI is looking at clinically relevant areas. But can we use that in the training itself? So if you have the ground truth labels as a source of one error which can be backpropagated to train the network, and if you have annotations from clinicians on what areas of the image are important, You can also have a second error function, which is those GradCam visualizations of where the AI is looking at, whereas where it should look at, and have the difference of those two basically images, and have a second error function which can also be backpropagated. So you are not only training on the class labels for a classification task, you are also training on which specific areas of the image to look at the same time. One can also use graph neural networks. So here we have an example of, again, digital pathology, where we have 3 scales of graphs. At the most zoomed out case, well, let's start with the most zoomed in case. So at the most zoomed in case, we have basically the cells of importance where the nodes of the graph are placed. So you have numerous small graphs. Then you have a cluster of those at a mesoscale, somewhere in the middle, where it looks at cell or tumor microenvironment. And then you have a final whole slide level graph, which looks at the entire tissue. And these 3 sets of graphs are connected in an interpretable way. So I can share these papers if anyone are important. These are all published. So those 2 were examples of sort of explainable models. Now, if we come to the second approach, so here we are taking any model and we are trying to increase the trustworthiness of the results by making the decisions more interpretable and robust or reliable. One important part of that is quantifying uncertainty. So, and there are many ways of doing it. Of course, you can do confidence levels, etc. But to make it slightly more rigorous and trustworthy, since we are talking about explainable AI, one particular method is conformal analysis. So in conformal analysis, you get a sort of guarantee of coverage. So if you set a alpha value, significance value of say 0.1 or 0.05, accordingly, you can get a guarantee that the true label will be part of the set of labels you give as output above a certain guarantee of 90 or 95%. What I mean by that is instead of giving one, say for the classification test, suppose we are doing cancer subtyping and there are 9 types of that particular cancer. So what are the minimum number of classes in your output such that the confidence or the guarantee of the true label being in that class is above that level of significance that you have set, which is 90 or 95%. This is basically what I have already discussed, so I will skip this slide. For generative case, for images, medical images, it is slightly different. So you can do conformal analysis for the generative case, regression, classification, etc. But the formulations become slightly different, and it's quite interesting. So the generation case, say for ChatGPT, and you are asking ChatGPT to write a poem or a or you have a generative image method where you are generating paintings. There, for the same prompt, perhaps you would want for different instantiations of it to give slightly different outputs. You might even prefer that. But for medical images, what does it mean for having the same query, which is sort of say some sort of patient characteristics, to have different images being generated? So as you can imagine, in this case, you have to quantify that inherent uncertainty of the generation process very carefully. So uncertainty quantification of generative models in medical imaging. So are those variations coming from artifacts which are coming in, and are those artifacts interfering with the biologically relevant things you are looking at, like the tumor? So now I will talk a little bit, like a couple of minutes, on the grand challenges we are facing, and we are interested in Turing-Roche as well. So I used to work exclusively with images, but the future of AI is multimodal. But as we try to deal with multimodal data, so in my case for cancer, it would be a combination of images like radiology or digital pathology with clinical genomic data for a better. The questions of explainability becomes even more important, because these data modalities might gel together nicely, or in some cases they might be orthogonal. For some patients, and that might not just be disease dependent, that might even be patient dependent. So disease heterogeneity and patient heterogeneity. And how can you do that while retaining your AI transparency so that people are confident in using it at the end of the day? So again, this slide I have sort of covered, and this is the only slide which is not from my body of work or my group's body of work. This is from a reference from the Mahmood lab. So you can integrate these in different ways, but depending on you are doing a late fusion, that is fusion at the decision level, or intermediate or early fusion, where you need the models to mesh together properly, and transparent models versus interpretable decisions come into play there as well, on how you are fusing these multiple modalities of data. Also, when you have these large data sets, multimodal large health data sets, you not only have missing data, you also have what is called structured missing data. In fact, the structured missingness part of the Wikipedia article on missing data was written by the Turing-Roche group. So structured missingness, what we mean by that is the hidden patterns in the missing data itself. So if we think of all the available data as 0 and the missing data as 1, can analysis of those patterns give intuition into things like healthcare inequity? Like certain parts of UK might not have access to certain tests. So it can bring out unfairness in the healthcare system, analyzing the structures in the missing data itself. Lastly, as I started out with mentioning the EU AI Act, so I would encourage scientists to also perhaps see whether they're interested in influencing the conversation of the day regarding AI safety and AI transparency through becoming members of global think tanks. The one I am member of, and there are many out there at the moment. It's called the Global Partnership on AI. Traditionally, we scientists have been happy to be doing just the technical innovation, but given the current scenario of AI, I think it's really important for scientists to also play a part of AI transparency and AI responsibility, also on the sort of regulations and policy side. So that's the end of my talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rohan. That was a really interesting overview of some of the research at Turing-Roche in particular on explainable AI, and nice to end with some initiatives that people can get involved with. So perhaps if you have some links to any of these initiatives, websites or platforms, you could share them as well in the chat if people are interested. So we have concluded the talk section of our session, and we'll move on to the panel discussion now. Do we have any prompt questions from the audience for all of our speakers? If so, please raise your hand or use the chat. Otherwise, I will move over to some of our pre-prepared prompts, and if any more audience questions come up, please feel free to use the chat and we will revisit them. So the first prompt question that I have for all our speakers, can I ask all of you to very briefly, like 1 or 2 sentences, give me your take on how building explainable AI is fundamentally different or not to building other AI tools? Why don't we start with Ahmed, Sophie, and then Rohan in the same order in which we had the talks.
Kind of difficult question. I think the difference is we are more focusing on understanding the model and less care about the accuracy of the model. Because usually, like my colleagues, those who work on theory only, the only thing they care about is the accuracy. And usually they only think about, okay, I have this model with good accuracy, but they don't care about the other steps. One of the simple thing I usually ask is the normalization of the, for example, we have tabular data. When we normalize them, we just lose the unit. Even if I have accuracy, good accuracy of the model, but I don't have the unit of the features that I use in the model. So what I will do with the accuracy? What I need is to understand the model when changing 1 unit of this, for example, feature or that, what would happen with the outcome? So I think fundamentally, I would say to understand the model more than to care about the power of differentiating between, let's say, cases or diagnosing.
Thank you, Ahmed. That was very clear. Let's move on to Sophie. What's your take?
Yeah, I agree with Ahmed on that. I think it depends a little bit, like whether you're interested in post hoc or building an inherently interpretable model as well. So the results and methods I was discussing are sort of things you apply after you've already trained it. But as you've previously seen, there are also ways that you can build inherently interpretable models where perhaps the decision mechanism is more humanly understandable, which some people refer to. And in that case, yeah, the whole sort of learning process is fundamentally different to if you were just seeking optimal performance in some cases. So I guess it depends on your goal. Yeah.
Right, yeah, thank you. So there's different angles and approaches to that. So Rohan, what do you think?
I will just add another layer on what Ahmed already said and say that in addition to population level accuracy, particularly in healthcare, since I mean, no patient is an outlier. You can't treat patients as outliers. So it needs to work individually at a personalized level. So that way, explainable AI in healthcare is quite different. So it not only has to have high accuracy population level, but you have to ensure that it has enough accuracy. And that's where my uncertainty quantification stuff comes in for each patient, right? And the other point is, what's the other point I noted, is user in the loop. So it would be, so we used to do, AI people used to do it separately on their like tower, separated from the rest of the world. But again, for explainable AI for healthcare, not only does it need to be transparent at the point of deployment, we would ideally have user input, patient and clinicians at the design phase, which makes the design quite different from other types of AI.
Yes, thank you. That makes sense. So individual level predictions obviously important in the clinic, especially. All right, thank you. We have, in the meantime, received a question in the chat from someone in the audience. asking whether there are any methods in explainable AI to demystify the transformer model.
There are a few coming out. I will put a specific link in the chat.
All right. Thank you. That's
but
helpful.
not many.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add on to that to say there are, so I think you would have seen there are different ways of classifying these different methods. One is global versus local, but also model agnostic versus model specific. So some of the techniques you can apply, some people refer them as white box versus black box explainable AI. It just gets a little bit silly with all the boxes, but essentially some methods can be applied to any model like SHAP, line, occlusion. So you could also apply that to a transformer. But I think the sort of uniqueness of it does also lend itself to specific explanation techniques like this paper probably shows.
All right, thank you. We have that resource in the chat now. Ahmed, is there anything you wanted to add, or are you happy for us to move on to the next?
No, I'm fine. Yeah, just to add to Sophie, that's it depends on how you classify the model agnostic versus model specific, or local explanation versus global explanation. Yeah.
Right, nice. Thank you. So we've got another question. The chat is booming. So this is another attendee asking about existing regulatory guidelines which govern the disclosure of explainable AI to common people, apart from the EU AI Act's provisions on explanations. If you're familiar with any other existing regulatory guidelines or upcoming guidelines.
So the EU AI Act is more aimed towards sort of public, scrutiny at not at an individual public level. Scrutiny more as a sort of means of audit. So this question is great. So what about XAI as a sort of right to information type of thing? So if an individual private citizen wants explainable, so as per my knowledge, there are no specific laws out there on that, but there is a heavy movement towards that among scientists and other stakeholders working towards AI policy. So maybe in the near future. In fact, I have one paper on that recently with Yoshua Bengio, who is like a Turing awardee, and a second paper which was just accepted, about to come out like any day, and those specifically call for this, which is transparency for individual users when they ask for it, which is not directly covered in the UAI Act. I will share the link of the last paper in the chat.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. It's always good to be aware of kind of any movements or even initiatives.
Yeah, there are a few initiatives. Not the rules are not out there yet, but maybe soon.
Nice, thank you, Rohan. Ahmed, Sophie, do you want to add anything, or are we happy to move on to the next prompt? All right, nice. So the next prompt from another attendee actually relates very closely to another kind of prompt that I've prepared in advance, which is basically about how we can validate and establish trust in the outcomes of explainable AI. And in fact, if we can and should establish gold standards for this, or whether validation can only work on a case-by-case basis, depending on the patient population or the disease type. So the attendee in the chat was asking relatedly if there are any examples of gold standard explainability in deployed AI devices. So maybe we can take turns again on this one. start perhaps again with Ahmed, then Sophie, and then Rohan, if that's okay. It's a few questions on, so feel free to address them however you like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm somehow with the case based, because one of the most significant aim of explainable is how the model is make a decision fairly against all the subgroups. Then the model, for example, if I have samples with white and non-white people, or for example, employed and unemployed people, male, female. So does the model work fairly among toward all of them? I think it's really difficult to build one single model or one explainable AI that works for all of them. Especially as also Rohan said, some models might involve more than one type of data, clinical data, imaging signals, and genetic data. And what works for a specific case might not work with others, or even like the age range of the samples, because children, like the change in their body and the physiology of their body is quite fast because the development of their cells compared when we get aging. So what work for kids might not work for older people. Yeah.
Yeah, I can come in. So I think that all the talks today sort of allude to the fact that there are still outstanding questions around explainable AI. So in terms of establishing trust in their outputs, I think we still need a lot of work we still need to do a lot of work in actually understanding these methods themselves. I'll put another paper in the chat about some quantitative metrics people have looked at to try and capture the robustness of some of these methods, because there's often a lot of noise. I think even from the results I showed, you can see how subtle it can be. Subtle changes to the input can cause completely different explanations to come out. So I think that level of variability is also still needs to be understood in order to establish trust and make sure that we can be confident that the explanations themselves are useful. But I definitely think that there's a use for them, and some researchers are also looking at how you can use the explanations themselves to derive new knowledge. So there is a little bit of a conundrum here where not only do you want your explanation to confirm what you already know or the features that you kind of already expect to be important, but there's also this other area of exploration and how we can derive insights from explanations as well. So it might not always be about validation and confirming existing knowledge, depending on the use case.
Thank you, Rohan.
So a medical device, which is a physical device, has a whole lot of safety standards in addition to a medical diagnostic tool like a software tool. There are some things which are common to both and a lot of additional things when it's a physical device. And it is not my area of expertise. However, I have put a link on the chat, which is from the British Standards Institution, as a reference article. But otherwise, I'm not an expert in this area.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Rohan. Because I think what struck me as well in your talk when you're discussing sort of prediction uncertainty estimates and so on, which obviously requires to set kind of thresholds for, like the example you gave with migraines, for what threshold of kind of prediction certainty we would recommend someone takes a painkiller versus do further diagnostic tests. So I suppose one question when we talk about kind of validation, gold standards, and so on, is where to set those thresholds and whether they perhaps should depend on kind of, for example, the type, the severity, or how invasive the treatment is that we would recommend, and adjust thresholds based on that, sort of on a case-by-case basis, or, you know, go with kind of more established standards across different disease types.
Well, case by case basis to me is more like patient by patient basis, in which case the conformal analysis technique that I talked about, and I'm about to share some links on that, is by design, by formulation, personalized. So it gives a individualized confidence bound or coverage guarantee for each patient.
Right. Yeah. There's different ways, I suppose, of conceptualizing kind of case by case, whether that's the individual level or disease type, for example.
For a disease type, it's difficult. Say, cancer is so heterogeneous, right? So some people say each of them are different diseases. Some rare cancers, like sarcoma, has 74 types, subtypes, or I think maybe more. I may be wrong. So at least 74, maybe more. So so I'm not exactly sure whether it's possible to have gold standards in that kind of scenario. Maybe something to do further research on.
Right, thank you. Yeah, sounds like a good area of research in this space. And thank you so much to the speakers. I think we have one final kind of time for a final prompt question, unless there's anyone in the audience who would like to raise another question or elaborate on a previous one. Otherwise, I will move on to a kind of final prompt question on sort of the development of explainable AI methods and tools, and sort of who can and should be involved in that, especially in the healthcare space, where we have, you know, patients, clinicians, but also policymakers. And I guess the question here is, how can we, and if so, how can we best involve all these different kind of stakeholders, patients, clinicians, policymakers, without kind of spoiling the soup with too many cooks, so to say, when developing explainable AI systems, but also kind of validation tools and potential gold standards. So maybe we'll go to Sophie first for a very quick take on this, and then move on to Ahmed.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, my quick take is definitely as all the above and should be involved. I think in terms of spoiling the soup, I guess it depends on the design of the study, and I think there is a lot of talk at the moment about needing to involve the input of patients and clinicians first. I saw quite a nice graphic once actually about comparing the needs of clinicians in terms of explainable AI to ML developers. And it kind of alludes to something I mentioned already, but this sort of toss up between ML developers potentially wanting to use explainable AI for debugging and helping us to create more reliable, useful models, and clinicians wanting to use explainable AI for the topics we've mentioned before about patient care and informing policy. So I think that there are potentially two sort of competing motivations sometimes with explainable AI. So thinking about how that influences your research question from the outset can help kind of guide what direction you take.
All right. Thank you, Sophie.
I agree with Sophie. I think anyone who need to explain the model decision for them should be involved. So if I'm a patient and I go to hospital and by AI device, I get diagnosed or not with a specific disease, I need explanation why the system thinks that I have this disease or not. Similarly, I think nowadays is the area of multidisciplinary. I don't expect like someone who develop AI model with biomedical data don't understand the nature of the data. At least should collaborate with the clinicians to understand the data, because understanding the data is a big part, an important part of designing explainable AI. Otherwise, it really would be difficult, like to to validate or to evaluate them.
Thank you, Ahmed. Rohan, what are your thoughts on this one? Maybe also from the Turing perspective.
Yeah, from the Turing-Roche perspective, we have had really fruitful a few workshops on clinician in the loop AI, how clinicians can be part of the AI development, not just as providers of annotations and labels and the data, but even the AI design itself. And that is especially tied to explainable AI. For example, in say cancer diagnosis, the gold standard is digital pathology, which is tissue image. You take a biopsy and look at the tissue under the microscope, and nowadays you also generate a digital image of that. The pathologists, when they are doing the diagnosis, have very specific visual features in mind. How to design. So we have a saying that it is not clinician in the loop AI, it should be AI in the clinical loop. So when you develop AI and you want that to see the light of the day and used in the clinic, you are not going to overnight revolutionize the standard clinical protocol. So the more you make it aligned to the clinical decision process, the higher the chances of translation. So in this case, for the diagnosis, you would want your AI method to look at those visual features and in the same sort of weightage that the pathologist thinks of, but rarely writes down when you reach the final decision. And that makes it not only explainable, but a valuable sort of input from the clinician in the design process. And you can do that through different ways like prototype learning or concept learning, etc. So that's one example of clinician in the loop. There can be many other ways. We are going to have a couple of perspective papers coming out of Turing-Roche related to this from our workshops that have happened. Yeah, and patients, I don't have that much of an experience with the patient groups. However, Turing does have groups like AMRSF who do a lot of patient consultation in AI design. It really comes into play when you have patient subgroups by age or sex or race who have different levels of engagement because of those protective characteristics with whatever AI tool you are developing, and how to maximize the engagement across the groups in a fair way. So AI fairness, machine learning fairness comes into play, bias as well, in a fair way, and make the AI tool as comfortable as possible for engagement across those different demographics. For that, early consultation with the patients really help.
Thank you. That's a really interesting take, in particular in relation to kind of biases in these models and addressing them potentially through kind of patient involvement from these underrepresented demographics. I think that's a really interesting angle and exciting to hear that there's work coming out from Turing on this. All right, thank you so much. Sophie has had to go already, and we are nearing the end of our session. So unless there are any final questions from the audience, no, I think we've heard from quite a few of you. There's lots of resources now in the chat. Thank you, Rohan and Ahmed, as well, for addressing these questions in the chat and sharing your resources. I think that will be very useful. And then I will close the session now. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to the audience for engaging and yeah, asking questions and listening.
Thanks, Sarah, for organizing.
Thank you, Sarah, for organizing it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.